Good afternoon. I think those hushes mean that it's time to get going. So good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this workshop this afternoon, which is also an episode of something called foreCASt, which I'll tell you a little bit about at the moment. My name's Emma Jackson. I'm Head of Social Justice at Citizens Advice Scotland. And we're really glad that you've come to join us this afternoon as we talk about maximising incomes, advice that changes lives. You're so very welcome, whether you're here with us in the room or if you're watching this on catch up, because we are filming this workshop this afternoon. foreCASt is a webinar series that we've been doing for about the last 18 months that showcases the data and insight from the Citizens Advice Network. We have a network of 58 cabs all across Scotland delivering life-changing advice to people, often at the moment of crisis. And we're able to look into why it is people are coming to see us, what are the main issues that people are facing, and interrogate and analyse that data, not just to understand what the problems are that people are facing, but to be able to present solutions to decision makers. We are running a series of webinars over the next few weeks, focused particularly in the run-up to the Scottish Holyrood elections. We were delighted to receive some funding from the Robertson Trust to be able to do that. So if you're not on our mailing list, if you've not had the opportunity to receive information from us, to join us at any of the other online events that we're doing over the coming months, hopefully the power of technology and the QR code means that you will get taken to a wee website, and it'll literally take you 2 seconds to pop in your name and your email address. We'd really love you to join us. We've a really great lineup of speakers this afternoon, but as well as that, we hope to have lots of opportunity for questions and for conversation as we wrestle with these issues together. So please do be thinking about the questions that you want to ask us, and we'll take plenty of time to ask some questions at the end. We're here today, as I said, to talk about the role of advice that we have here across Scotland. Many of you are involved in delivering advice through the organisations that you're from, and you know firsthand the power of that advice, particularly face-to-face advice delivered at a community level, really can change lives. We wanted to begin our session this afternoon with perhaps just hearing just a very brief reflection from someone I'm going to call Malcolm. Malcolm did an interview with one of the members of staff he'd been working with in his local cab. And we'll just listen to Malcolm for a second, how he describes advice has been able to help him feel more hopeful.
About the future, I think, in terms of, I'm going to say this, I hope it is recorded this time, that I know there's yourself and I don't know how many's in here, right? Mm-hmm. But not just with me, but you help and advocate and get support and all that for a whole number of people. So I feel more positive about the future, knowing that CAB is going to be here.
I think it's really powerful, isn't it, hearing somebody feel more hopeful for the future because of the advice they've been able to receive in their local community. I'm going to get us started with our first speaker. I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, David Hilverty. David is Director of Impact at Citizens Advice Scotland, where he's been for the last 3 years. Previously, David worked for the Scottish Government, and before that was Deputy Chief Executive at Money Advice Scotland. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Emma, and how you doing, folks? I wanted to start with a quick word on why we're doing this pre-election series, because as one of Scotland's leading charities, we are, of course, politically impartial, but we're not politically neutral, because neutrality would mean being silent to the harm that we see, that our network sees every single day in communities all across Scotland. As Emma said, there's real power and there's real purpose in what we do, both in terms of the immediate wraparound support that we offer, but also what we can change in the long term, to be preventative, because we're not passive observers in the landscape around us. We're active participants. We directly influence and change and shape policy and legislation and drive better outcomes. Now, many of the issues that we mentioned here today or across this series may not be new to you. Many of them you may have heard before, but what you're going to hear is repeat across this series is that we can't be back here in 5 years' time calling for the same things. There's real authenticity in our evidence base. It's entrenched in the experience of real people like Malcolm, who you've just heard. Their advice changes lives. We support an extraordinary number of people every single year. And when you do that, you build up a real vastness of insight and understanding, and we're determined to make that count and to take that right to the heart of debate with this new series. It's a very particular type of insight as well, because we see people who are facing most harm. We see where support is needed most, because typically, you get this, people present for advice when something's gone wrong, when the system's failed them. And we used to say that we provide advice on everything, even if it's a broken kettle. We don't say that anymore, because the issues that people come to us about, they're not about inconvenience. They're not about people feeling just a wee bit curious. It's urgent. It's social security, it's debt, it's money, it's energy, it's your home. The things that all of us need to live a decent and dignified life. Now, narrative will no doubt punctuate this election, as it does in every pre-election period, about tough decisions, tough choices to be made. Being absolutely no doubt that the people facing the toughest of decisions, the hardest of choices every single day, are like those walking through the doors of third sector organisations like ourselves, because after more than a decade of austerity, of perma-crisis, we are so often the last door for people after rebounding around other broken public services. Now, these are experiences that must be heard at all times, but particularly so at election time, to help close that proximity gap that so often exists between people experiencing harm and the people who can choose to end that. If our evidence base shows where the harm is, for our first ever in-person episode of foreCASt, as you said, Emma, it took us to maximising incomes and it took us to social security. Consistently our number one advice demand area across multiple years, and we're really good at it. You know, in the last year alone, we returned £170 million back into pockets of people all across Scotland. While that sort of number one demand area has remained constant, it only tells part of the story, because there are, of course, trends within trends. Here you can see the emergence of Social Security Scotland payments, and particularly the adult disability payment. And what we've also included in the table at the bottom of that screen there is that this isn't just a like-for-like shift, a like-for-like replacement. What's really striking across those 5 years, and that slide should say 2016 to 2017 rather to 2021, is pieces of advice are up considerably. You know, now part of that relates no doubt to the complexity of something's new. Part of it's also a real reminder of how what we do, what sector colleagues here today do, is different. You know, the advice you get from a third sector organisation is different. It's not once and done. It's not replicable with a call to a contact centre. And therefore, the outcomes that you receive are also very different. Now, we all know that Social Security in Scotland has forged a different path. That language of dignity and fairness and respect is language that we all recognise. There's several ample improvements that need to be made to these systems and structures, not to mention that we need to look at adequacy. But these high-level principles still really matter, because I'm sure you all recognise this. In the last year, the rhetoric surrounding social security has become ever more divisive and ever more demonising. Claims of overspend and overdiagnosis, when all the evidence, I'm sure you've heard throughout the course of today, and you'll hear over the course of this session, it points to the reverse. It points to deepening poverty and deepening hardship. Now, what's been won already is not guaranteed to stay won. What's won today can be lost tomorrow. You know, that idea that the status quo, that notion that progress is linear and only moves in one direction, that's not a given. And we can't underestimate the attempts to erode the ground that has been won on social security. And I thought in this most recently in terms of some of the response to the ending of the 2-child limit. And like many organisations in this room, we advocated and campaigned hard on that. Yet what the scrapping of the 2-child limit is, what it amounts to, is effectively stopping doing something that was just actively harmful. Now, that's in no way to downplay how much that was the right thing to do and the overdue thing to do. And again, I've spoken about familiar language. I'm sure this is familiar imagery. It wasn't written last year. It was written 8 years ago when the cap was first introduced. So again, what's been lost can then take some time to be won again. So yes, keep making the case on minimum income guarantee for the uprating Scottish child payment, but alongside that we need to hold our ground. We need to hold the centre of the ring. After the session today, audience members will get a really tight, a really concise briefing from us on what we need the next Scottish Government to do on social security. It includes really key changes to delivery mechanisms, includes key changes for advisors, a new escalation route that allows expert advisors to get to people much sooner and get outcomes to people who are needing the payment a lot sooner. But we're not just asking other people to reimagine how they do things, we're doing that too. Very shortly you hear from Teresa, and Teresa's cab is one of a small number who are involved in our Roots Out Crisis programme. This is an example of real innovation in service design and delivery through a combination of intensive named person support. The person knows you, they know your family, as well as the flexibility of cash microgrants. So we know advice changes lives. Colleagues in the room know that. Organisations like Shelter, organisations like One Parent Family Scotland and the people of Scotland agree. Our polling shows that 9 out of 10 people believe that face-to-face advice is important and that that advice should be provided by people with local knowledge and local understanding. I often say to colleagues that when you walk into a cab, there's a real magic to it. You know, that mixture of intense urgency, but also that calm reassurance that at last, often after a long time, someone's got your back. And there's not many feelings like that, and someone's got you. Local advice underpinned by local knowledge, how local people want it. And again, we're delighted to have Stephen here today, and there's a brilliant recommendation within the Commission's advice to the Scottish Government on its Child Poverty Delivery Plan around the recognition of advice services as a core part of Scotland's anti-poverty infrastructure. That's language that we all need to get on board with and amplify, because when we talk about the anti-poverty infrastructure, I'm well aware that it doesn't look like this visual that's on screen at the moment, does it? But here's a thought. Next Scottish Government won't close the attainment gap without investment in schools and teachers. It won't cut waiting times without investment in the NHS. And it's our assertion, therefore, that next Scottish Government will not achieve its ambition to eradicate poverty without a sustainable anti-poverty infrastructure, and advice is a key component of that. It means multi-year funding. That means local insight and local knowledge. That means services designed with people like Roots Out of Crisis, because I think in all of our lives it can feel that we're sort of bounced into our interactions with public services a hell of a lot, often when something's gone wrong, often when we don't really want to have to do that. For me, it's my dad, and I've seen what hospitals do. I've seen what social work do, I've seen what care home staff do, and it's essential work and it's hard work, but so is this. Now we're increasingly up against a new type of innovation. In the last year, we've identified several private commercial firms offering a kind of no-win, no-fee style service to access social security, commercialising and profiteering from a service that people can get for free. It's sophisticated, it's slick, it's targeted. And in the case of Donald here, I think he lost about £1,200 to one of these firms, roughly about 15% of the overall award. Again, you see how lucrative this can become. You also see how unethical it quite clearly is. And for us, it's a pernicious practice. It's profiteering from people who need support most. And it's the very worst kind of innovation and opportunism. You know, it clearly undermines the policy intent of these payments to provide that vital financial support. So we're really clear that we want the next Scottish Government to commit to a review of this emerging practice, as well as setting out the action that we all collectively want to see to end it. And again, more detail on that will feature as part of our post-session briefing. Final analysis I want to share before wrapping up is a reminder of the context that we're in as we come out of winter. And I think the most striking aspect that you'll see in these current visuals is that upsurge in the final quarter of the year, that post-Christmas surge in demand. And what's the context for the third sector here? Well, at the very time that this essential frontline service is most in demand, and I'm aware very much that I'm singing to the choir here in some respects, that's where demand is at its highest, and that's where uncertainty for third sector organisations is most pronounced. You know, most third sector organisations receive funding on an annual basis. It means at the end of each year there can be huge uncertainty about what's happening next. And the immense stress that places on our anti-poverty infrastructure cannot be understated. Now, it's hard for me, advice is about bringing stability to volatility, and yet this approach means that our advisors' own livelihoods are often marked with a level of precarity and at the mercy of short-term funding cycles that we don't see in any other essential frontline services. Now, amid all of that, one thing remains really certain and really constant, we make a difference. You know, even in this context, we make a remarkable difference across the sector, whether it's money in people's pockets or whether it's quite literally helping people to sleep at night. But imagine what else we could be. You know, we ain't going to crack decades worth of poverty and inequality in 10 and 12-month funding cycles, right? And a quick sort of counterpoint, a kind of alternative reality. What if we weren't here? What if the third sector wasn't here? Where do the hundreds of thousands of people go for this life-changing advice and support? And what would the impact be of not having these expert, compassionate interventions, life-changing outcomes in communities all across Scotland? Because as I said at the very outset, and we'll say throughout, these aren't just abstract numbers. These are real people, real advisors, real outcomes. Ours is work that changes lives. So together, let's ensure that we're not back here in 5 years' time saying the same things again.
Thank you so much, David. Lots to reflect on and hopefully lots that's got you thinking in terms of what kind of a discussion that we can have later on this afternoon. I'm really delighted to introduce our next speaker, Professor Stephen Sinclair. We're absolutely delighted, Stephen, to have you with us. Stephen is co-director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit at Glasgow Caledonian University. But Stephen's also chair of the Poverty and Inequality Commission. And it's here under those auspices that we've invited Stephen to come and share some reflections. So over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Emma. And it's good to know that I'm joined by one of my fellow commissioners, Kim. So you can direct some of your questions at the end to her as well, if you wish. Thanks to Citizens Advice for inviting the Poverty and Equality Commission to come here and for organising this. I know it's a great deal of work. And I'm here to learn as much as to talk. I've been asked to speak for between 5 and 10 minutes, focusing on devolved issues, focusing on solutions and options for whichever government might be in place after the next parliamentary elections, and to focus on our recommendations with particular regard to the recommendation that David mentioned for the advice sector. So that sets out the structure of what I'm going to cover in the next 5 or 10 minutes, but I think it's necessary to start with just a brief description of the role, the remit and function of the Poverty and Equality Commission. I'm sure that many in this audience are pretty expert on it, but I don't assume that everyone is. So I'll just, if you forgive me, just say a few words about what we do and why we do it. We were set up by an amendment to the 2017 Child Poverty Act, so we're a statutory body, and that's important. We have certain duties and obligations that we have to satisfy. That Act, as you know, was passed unanimously in the Scottish Parliament. A point that we emphasise that every party has a moral obligation to contribute to the fulfilment of that Act. And the centre of that Act is the commitment of the Scottish Government and Scottish people to eradicate child poverty by 2030. Now, by eradicate, we have in mind there a number of targets, but the headline target that gets most attention is the relative child poverty measure. So the aspiration is to reduce child poverty to 10% or less by 2030. The current level of child poverty based on last year's statistics in Scotland is 22%. So you can see that there is a considerable challenge facing us. We need a 12% reduction in relative child poverty within the space of 4 years. That is, to put it mildly, quite a significant gap. It is, in fact, an unprecedented reduction that we're looking at in order to meet our commitments. So considerable work to be done in the next 4 years, and therefore a unique opportunity in this parliamentary election to refocus energies and attention on that. The role of the Commission in relation to this is what we call our 3 A's. That's advice, accountability and advocacy. We are charged with providing evidence-based recommendations to the Scottish Government and all the other public bodies which have a duty in relation to that, about policies, practices, measures to contribute to reducing child poverty. And that's where engaging with audience like this is particularly useful, because you have expertise and intelligence which we can draw upon to inform our advice. The second role is accountability. So we published an annual report. Our next will be published in May, just actually around about the period of the election, where we comment on progress made in the preceding year and make recommendations for further changes that need to be in place. And our third role is equally important, advocacy. Making the case that child poverty is a scourge, but also one that is reducible. that this is not a question of fate, but a matter of political choice. It is possible to significantly reduce child poverty. It will be challenged to meet the 2030 targets, but we know from history, and we know from comparative evidence, that we can make significant inroads into addressing child poverty. A couple of other things it's important to be aware of because of our focus and capacity. The Commission consists of 9 members. There is another member of the Commission, not in this room, but decided to go to another event, Louise Hunter, so you can talk to her. But commissioners devote 1 day a month to the work that they do on top of their day jobs. I have the luxury of 1 day a week on top of my day job. And the reason I mentioned that is because we do have capacity limitations and we have statutory duties. And I tend to bang on a lot about child poverty. But we're not monomaniacs. We are aware, we are the Poverty and Inequality Commission. We are aware of the wider set of issues, but our focus by law has to be on child poverty. So that's why you'll be hearing most about that in our recommendations. Final thing about how we work is we work in partnership with an experience panel. They represent a wide range of groups, geographies and interests. We've worked in partnership with them in our current iteration on almost all of our reports. Certainly our recommendations I'm going to speak about in a moment, and our annual scrutiny report is published in partnership with them. They also provide essential insights into the lived reality of poverty, the delivery of services and recommendations for how to make improvements. In terms of those recommendations, we published our advice to the Scottish Government on the next Child Poverty Delivery Plan, which will be published in May. Is that correct? Yeah. We published that in November. It contains 12 recommendations, or sets of recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them. 11 of them are directed to the Scottish Government, and I think unprecedentedly we had one directed to the UK Government because we thought there were factors which set the wider context that have to be taken into account and addressed if we are going to address the issue of child poverty. The recommendation which might be of particular interest to this audience is our third recommendation, which David has hinted at, that we recommend strengthening the advice services with secure long-term funding, recommending advice as a core part of the anti-poverty infrastructure, and increasing funding so that advice services are better able to engage in more active outreach and further their activities in reaching groups who are so-called hard to reach, but historically easy to ignore. In terms of the advice sector, CAS and its partners and similar organisations, we do regard them as an essential public service. The advice sector has a potential contribution to all of the 3 key drivers which determine and shape child poverty. That is increasing income from employment, reducing household costs, and increasing income from social security. At the moment, Citizens Advice and the advice sector operate as an essential emergency service, as a last resort for those facing crisis and in desperate circumstances. And by necessity, based on the level of demand, they are forced to be reactive and responsive. But we all know, and we have heard since the Christie Commission in 2011, that what we really need is preventative so-called upstream interventions. And the Citizens Advice and related sector can make an important contribution to that. As the late, great John Wyatt Wilson, Professor of Social Policy and one of the founding members of the Child Poverty Action Group, once pointed out, a decent, secure, stable income is what he called the clean water of economic prosperity. It's the basic hygiene function that we need. Secure jobs which pay sufficient amounts and are reliable are essential to that, but so is a core underpinning of social security. And reflecting that, our first 2 recommendations beyond the advice sector recommendation is that we advocate that Scotland as a whole embrace the recommendations of the Minimum Income Guarantee Expert Group and take that forward. That will require some discussion and collaboration with the UK Government, but the first steps could be taken within Scotland. Our second recommendation is a significant and substantial increase to the Scottish Child Payment. The reason I mention the targets and our duty is because there is no other lever available to us between now and 2030 that is going to make the significant and substantial change to the child poverty figures. Access to employment, removing the barriers that people face, reducing household costs, these are all essential and important, but they're more indirect, and I'm afraid they are slower to execute. So the Commission has necessarily, because of our duties, because of the urgency, paid quite a lot of attention to the role of social security. We also make recommendations in relation to employment. The recommendations of the Fair Work Convention we are strongly behind, employment support, childcare, affordable housing, and some of the measures that are available within Scotland to address those with no recourse to public funds. We wish a situation, which I think is shared by citizens in the money advice sector, where it's an exceptional rather than essential service. It should not be at the front line of provision, which is where it has been forced and been placed by circumstances. So we are arguing that this is a sector which is making an essential contribution. It has a vital role in supporting the well-being of households, but through your engagement with communities across Scotland, it also has a vital role in evidence, testimony, and the intelligence that the Commission need in order to strengthen our recommendations. That's why I'm particularly interested in hearing from this audience and from the questions and the information you can provide us. So I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Great to remind us about the role of prevention as we have this conversation this afternoon, and that question of what might we be doing if we're not dealing with emergency and crisis day in, day out. Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our final speaker this afternoon, Teresa O'Hare. Teresa is CEO of East Renfrewshire CAB, where Teresa's been part of the CAB since 1999, growing what was a small team at that point to an absolutely thriving and essential service for her local community. Teresa, we're absolutely delighted to have you here and to hear some of the experiences of your teams and people in your community.
Okay. Thank you, Emma. I've had the privilege of being the manager of the Citizens Advice in East Renfrewshire, as Emma says, for the last 26 years. It's an honour to be here today and share a little of my journey, which started actually quite unexpectedly. I first saw the job advert for Citizens Advice while I was on maternity leave with my daughter. And at the time, I'd just completed a business degree and was working with the DWP on appeals service. And I was juggling sleepless nights and a very energetic 3-year-old son to boot as well. I wasn't planning a career change, but something about the role just spoke to me. And when I started in August 1999, it was Barrhead Citizens Advice Bureau, one small office on Barrhead Main Street, open 12 hours a week, run by 8 part-time volunteers with one phone line and a kettle that barely worked. What we all did have then was a strong sense of purpose, and over the years, working alongside colleagues across Scotland and seeing advice systems in other places, it's reminded me that what we sometimes take for granted here, that is free, confidential and impartial advice for everyone, is seen as extraordinary elsewhere. Today, we cover all of East Renfrewshire, with 9 community drop-ins across the authority. We're the only CAB and the only independent advice agency in the area. And as someone who lives locally, that journey is something I'm incredibly proud of. The reach means we see every day how closely people's financial stability is tied to the advice they can access, which is why maximising incomes is such a critical part of our work. When we talk about maximising incomes, it can sound technical, forums, calculations, eligibility rules. But in advice services, maximising income is something about much more fundamental, whether people can live with dignity and security. At East Renfrewshire Citizens Advice Bureau, we support an area often seen as relatively affluent, but that perception can mask real hardship and unmet need. And we often find that the Bureau is a place where that hidden pressure can finally come to the surface. Across the Citizens Advice Network in Scotland, more than half of the people who come to us need help with benefits. In practice, that means around half of the advice we give is about the benefits system. Helping people understand what they're entitled to, navigate complex applications, and challenge decisions through determinations and tribunal appeals, with an advisor guiding them through what can be seen as a very daunting process. That tells us something very important. People are not failing to cope. Systems are failing to deliver adequate, accessible support. And I want to bring to life just one short case example. We supported a parent of a disabled child who was working part-time while also providing full-time care. Rising costs meant they were relying on credit just to get through the month. They were told they were probably not entitled to anything further, so they just didn't apply. When they came to us at foreCASt, we carried out a full benefit check. In reality, they were entitled to additional disability-related support and other income-related help. Accessing that support wasn't simple. Complex forms, medical evidence, long waits, and challenging decisions. With advice and support, they had secured additional income that stabilised their household and reduced their debt. But the most powerful thing they said wasn't about the money. They said, "I didn't know I was allowed to ask for help." And that is something we hear far too often. In 2025, almost 1 in 3 people advised by Bureau were advised on a Social Security Scotland benefit, with over half relating to adult disability payment. Nearly 80% had long-term condition or disability, and many were able to work because of ill health. This isn't about people opting out of work. It's about illness, disability, caring responsibilities, and the incomes that just don't stretch far enough. As David mentioned, Roots Out of Crisis was launched by Citizens Advice Scotland in September 2024 to take a different approach to financial crisis, one focused on early intensive support and long-term stability, rather than repeat emergency response. Using named advisors and flexible micro-grants, the project not only supports people through crisis, but also generates the evidence needed to push for wider system changes. At foreCASt, again, David mentioned, we are one of the Bureau delivering Roots Out of Crisis locally, and Grace is here today, working in partnership with the Trussell Trust to prevent the need for food banks by intervening early. What's been particularly powerful here is the combination of a named advisor and access to a flexible grants budget. This means that people aren't being passed between services. They build trust with that one advisor who can act quickly, respond holistically, and remove immediate barriers while working in longer-term income issues. For example, we supported someone referred at crisis support due to a benefit delay and mounting arrears. Throughout Roots Out of Crisis, the advisor was able to stabilise the situation, addressing immediate hardship through a small grant, while resolving the underlying benefit issue and maximising the income. That combination of a trusted advisor and flexible support is what prevented repeat crisis. And this is exactly the kind of model we need to see rolled out nationally if we're serious about meeting the needs of people in the most complex of circumstances. And I also want to be honest here about what it's like to deliver advice in the current socio-economic environment. Compared to 5 to 10 years or even 20 years ago, it's not just that more people need help, it's that the issues are far more complex. People come to us with multiple overlapping problems: disability, debt, housing insecurity, caring responsibilities, ill health, and systems that just don't join up. And increasingly, after we've done everything possible, maximised income, challenged decisions, accessed all the available support, some people are still left with deficit budgets. There isn't always a solution, and that is incredibly hard for both the clients and the advisors. Advisors are sitting every day with people who are doing everything right and still can't make ends meet. Holding that reality while continuing to provide compassionate, high-quality advice takes a real emotional toil. We support advisors through training, supervision, and peer support, But the truth is, advice services are increasingly absorbing the impact of wider systems inadequacies. Our Older People's Project and our Supporting Parents and Children in East Renfrewshire, which focuses on children with special needs, shows what's possible when advice is properly resourced. In both cases, advice increases household income, improves well-being, and prevents problems escalating. East Renfrewshire Council has seen this impact directly, and as a result, we have secured core funding for East Renfrewshire Citizens Advice Bureaux and these 2 projects for the next 2 years. That reflects an understanding that advice is preventative infrastructure, not an optional add-on. Advice can and does change lives, but advice alone cannot fix inadequate incomes. In 2025 alone, Advice Bureaus supported people to 50 million gains from Social Security Scotland benefits. Over the last 5 years, that figure is more like 130 million, most of it going to disabled people, carers, families with children, and people living in our most deprived communities. If we are serious about tackling poverty, we need adequate social security systems, simpler, faster systems, and sustained investment in advice, including models like the Routes Out of Crisis that genuinely prevent hardship and reduce barriers to support. Advice shows us what works and where the system is breaking. And as we look ahead, the challenge is not just responding to the crisis, but redesigning systems so fewer people reach it in the first place. Because when advice works, people don't just survive, they regain stability, dignity, and hope. And that's what maximising incomes should truly mean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for sharing some of those experiences, not just of folks in local communities, but of your staff as well. And it was really good to hear about those bright spots, you know, where the funding is right, then it works, and it really does make a difference. And it's good to focus on the things that are working, as well as the things that we know that are failing. And you so eloquently highlighted the system's failure. So thank you very much. We hopefully have about 20 minutes now to have some questions and conversation. Hopefully you've been thinking about what you might want to ask the panel as we've been listening to them this afternoon. A couple of my colleagues are going to do some roving mics. So yeah, I guess over to you if anyone has any questions. Yeah, that'd be brilliant.
Thank you. So we know that sustainable funding is essential in making sure we can have sustainable advice. So I guess I'd love to hear if you as a panel have any ideas on how we can shift the dial with the new next Scottish Government to think about how they can prioritise that sustainable long-term funding for advice so we don't get the pressures that David highlighted in his presentation.
Great, really important question. And Nicole, I think there was a question just on the end.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. This touches on what's just been asked actually as well, and it was a really insightful session. So much of it resonates really strongly with my own role at Money Advice Scotland, particularly the challenges that you've shared and that we're all really acutely aware of. We know how complex and difficult the work that advisors do is, and so my question is, what can we do or what can be done to ensure that the advisors who are delivering this life-changing advice receive the support that they need and that keeps them in the roles, given the challenges that we've talked about. Thanks.
Brilliant. We'll maybe turn to the panel and come back because I know there's some other questions and we'll pick up some more in a second. So sustainable funding, what's really needed to shift the dial with this next Scottish Government coming in? And a question there about how do we better support our advice workforce so that people are healthy and well and able to stay in there. So maybe start with yourself, David.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And the 2 points are absolutely interconnected, as you say. I think some of the frustration about the advisor wellbeing, advisor workforce piece that you mentioned, Abby, is that when I said in my presentation we can't be here in 5 years' time saying the same things. We've been saying the same things for the best part of 5-6 years now. And during that time, when people started talking about an advice workforce strategy, we started talking about low levels of well-being. Since then, we've had a pandemic, the cost of living crisis, which ain't over, by the way, energy crisis. So all of that sort of cumulative impact, that cumulative harm, and we're saying the same things. And I think to connect it to the other question, advisor well-being isn't about some of the approaches that we see. It ain't about mindfulness webinars, and it ain't about scented candles. It's about feeling valued as a workforce, you know. It's the structural change that we need to see. And to make the case for that, I think we do that in two ways. I think it's some of the brilliant framing, the compelling language that Stephen's mentioned and that features so prominently in that report. But I think it's a bit more than that. I think it's about, as I said in my presentation, highlighting what happens when we don't have that. The worst kind of innovation in the sector, this creep of private commercial firms, that's not good for the people we support, and it's also not good for government.
I'll address the first question a bit more. The second question does, I guess, relate to funding and capacity, and the big issue is funding, and how do we make the case for that? And that's where the role of the Commission as an advocate becomes important. I have to be careful what I say, because we are a non-departmental and non-politically affiliated organisation. But I think, as David said, and we have experts in here, about framing and the rhetoric and shaping the consciousness of what is viable is within the remit of the Commission. One of the things I would advocate is that we need to rethink what counts as a cost and what counts as a benefit. There are undoubtedly short-term investment costs that are going to be required in order to not only make the advice sector sustainable, but to meet many of the other recommendations we put forward. That is unavoidable. If we're serious about the Act and we're serious about addressing poverty generally, there is going to have to be investment in the short term. Now, that's a difficult case to make for any politician in this particular climate. CAS, the advice sector, the third sector and the Commission do have a role in trying to enable that to be a more palatable message to convey. That this is not just giving to the deserving poor, this is an investment in all of us. We are a very divided and fractured society at the moment, and social security, investment in people are one of the ways we can bring people together. For example, one of the historical lessons that we have is that there is still quite a lot of pensioner poverty around, but it's nothing like the scale it was when I was first studying social policy in the 1980s. When I was a student studying social policy, if they asked about who was in poverty, it was pensioners. The highest prevalence and the highest risk. Now, we got a social consensus around addressing that as a very egregious problem. It took quite a lot of changes. It's not just down to social security, the private and occupational pensions and so on, but it was doable, and that's a great success. And now we have universal political commitment to the triple lock. So I think there's a positive lesson there that if we can do it for pensioners, we can do it for other groups as well. So we have to make it possible for politicians to make statements which they don't get shot down for. And we do what we can to pave the way towards that.
It's just such a great example to remind ourselves that this is a problem that we can solve. Particularly when you think about social security and the design flaws that are so inherent. If they've been designed like that, we can design something different, we can design something better. And fatalism, we don't have to keep believing this is the only way to do this. Tracy, I wonder what those questions mean for yourself in your local CAB.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think one of the things that we touched on earlier is like case studies really tells the story of like the robust evidence out there, and that's what's happening on the ground. And showing that advice prevents crisis and therefore saves the public money in the long term. Just central funding rather than short local funding. But talking about local, we touched on, we've been fortunate enough that we've got 2-year funding extended, which is not the case for all bureaux across the country. But locally we do a lot of what's called like advice in action, where we invite the elected members into the bureau, and they get to sit in some of the, with only obviously the client's authority, to see what's happening. I go to the council chambers for the elected members quarterly to do an update. A lot of other areas it's just the statutory, but I go along and tell them what's happening on the ground and what evidence there is there. And that for us has resulted in this continued funding. So it's really about getting them to events even like this so that they can see what's actually happening. Obviously, yes, in terms of staff well-being, sadly, even locally ourselves, we've had to put security systems in for the first time ever. And that's because, as I'd mentioned, some clients just sometimes don't like what you're having to tell them now because there is no further help there for them. So it's all about protecting the staff and the well-being. And as David says, the Bureau is a very welcoming place to be. And we've got 20 staff and 29 volunteers. You've got to have that good camaraderie as well. You've got to have the kind of backed up with the social and foster that good environment to work in. And obviously it works both ways. Me as a manager, my door's always open for people so that people aren't building things up. And we've got a very, very, very good team as well. But yeah, recently Citizens Advice Scotland have also introduced national counselling services and things like that as well. And all the staff have been trained in how to access that and general well-being. So all these things go together to hopefully help staff well-being.
Deliver that support. I just think a really powerful point you were making, Teresa, there about kind of trying to bring decision makers as close to the issue as possible. I'm sure in the not too distant future we're all going to start to get inundated with candidates who want to perhaps get a little bit closer, and I think these are the opportunities we need to grab with both hands to help people face the reality of issues that exist within communities and remind them that there are solutions out there to the problems that folks face. Right, hopefully we've got some more kind of questions, which is absolutely brilliant. So there was a lady on the end there, and then a lady at the front here, yeah.
There's two questions I've got. So I'm actually a volunteer, and I've been a funder before, so I've got a little bit of both experience, but I suppose I see a lot of contradictions in what's being said. You know, I see that the bureaus have to work reactively and responsively, and I completely appreciate that that's the case. But I suppose that's, in my mind, that's contradictory to the point where people are coming in crisis, and that's their last point of contact as well. So there's three things I want to ask, and one of the ones is, if someone's coming as a last point of contact, what is the action that is taken if there's no advice able to be given? The second is, because the bureaus all work independently, how can resources be saved where they can all work together for a long-term strategy, considering funding can be short-term? And the third one I've forgotten.
Okay. Yeah, so I think if I'm hearing you right, no, that's great. Something about, as Teresa described, what's those interactions for people where the problem sort of can't be solved, and what does working together as a network look like? So we can take some time to talk about that. And then, just at the front there, Nicole.
Thanks. I've got two questions. Well, one's really a call to the action for the room. Last week I heard someone from Finland speak, and they'd got homelessness down to 112 families, and then there was a change of government in 2023, and homelessness is now rapidly rising. So it's kind of, to Stephen, you know, we're at 22% at the moment for child poverty in Scotland, but it is much higher in England, and I think we should not forget that. The battle that we had in the consensus before to win it could so easily be lost, given that so many of the parliamentarians are changing. So there's a huge, huge job to be done on messaging with all the new parliamentarians, some of whom have very different views. But there's another question I wonder about, and it's to do with misuse of public funds. And given the connection we know between insecure work, should work coaches be used to place people in roles that are not fair work?
Okay. And I'll maybe just take the lady in yellow just because you're there, and then we will have a think about these questions.
So really welcome Professor Sinclair's sharing the recognition of the Commission that the importance of advice and wraparound support as part of income maximisation. I'm interested in building on that. We hear about cash-first approaches as a way of reduced crisis demand and how that could be central to genuine prevention. So I'm interested in just views about what the real barriers are to embedding cash-first approaches at scale, and realistically, if you think there's a genuine appetite within Scottish Parliament to move further and faster.
Okay, great. So I'm going to remind the panel, and you don't have to answer, each of you answer all the questions, but what you would like to reflect on. So we had that first question about what happens sort of seeing people when you're out of tools in the toolbox as an advisor. What does that look like? And also how do our network of CABs kind of work collaboratively to deliver a service? Susan was reminding us about, I guess, what you were talking, David, about the need to not lose ground. And as Stephen said to us, we've got a mammoth task on our hands to try to reduce child poverty, and that's the direction we think we're going in. But what if the reverse of that might happen? And perhaps some reflections as well about the role of employment coaches helping people to take the right thing for them. And then finally a question there about the role of cash first as we deliver advice, as we try to tackle poverty. So pick from that what you would perhaps like to offer some reflections on. We've got about 5-6 minutes just to land this. So David.
Cool. I think that point about Bureau working together, I think there are multiple projects that we can hold up across the network where we've almost been sort of forced and compelled to innovate, to stay competitive and to stay alive for the kind of requirements that's expected of funders. I think that what we see across the Citizens Advice network and what we also see across the broader third sector is an approach to cross-sector, cross-organisational working that we don't always see even in aspects of government. You know, and I think one of the key things and one of the unique insights that we've got to come back to that insight piece is that when you come to the Citizens Advice Network or many other third sector organisations, you ain't just getting advice in one area. You know, we're seeing that full picture. You know, how many services in any of our lives do we go for support on one issue and then get help with 7 or 8 other different issues? So I think there already is that innovation happening within service delivery. Again, I think that the work that Teresa mentioned, the Roots Out of Crisis, genuinely sector leading. You know, that brilliant combination of named caseworker support who knows you, knows your family, and also that flexibility around the microgrants, which, to the point around cash first, is so central to that as well. I also want to pick up on a point somebody made around sort of being reactive and responsive. You know, there's this big push across Scottish Government, particularly around whole family support. You know, this idea that the local solutions rest in local communities. And we get that, we agree with that, but what we'd say is we aren't always empowered and resourced to be that. And I think the experience for most people across the network, people across the third sector, is you feel locked into the sort of mitigation of state failure, locked into service delivery. Brilliant projects happening across the network, such as one in Glasgow around the legacy of the Commonwealth Games housing village, with the athletes' village converted into social housing. The damp, the mould, the living conditions there are absolutely abject. We've been able to highlight that because we stepped outside the service delivery. And I think when we do that, we gain some really incredible insight that we then use to try and change the system.
Yeah, Stephen.
I'll try and address a combination of points very quickly. Interesting point about the cash-first approach. The Commission and a number of other organisations, including Imagine the Advice Sector, very strong advocates of this. And it came to the fore, particularly during COVID. And there was a resistance to that. But with testimony, such as yourselves, and evidence, it did persuade some of the more recalcitrant local authorities that this was the most effective measure. However, I should say, and Kim can testify to this, it's great she's in the room, that the Commission and our experience panel took a different view in a recent consultation by the National Fuel Poverty Advisory Board. We advocated, we had to put forward 2 sets of recommendations. The review of the Commission was based on cash first, but the experience panel said that they found a certain amount of reassurance from having the money directly added to their fuel bills. And I think that tells you a lot about one of the underpinning virtues of the minimum income guarantee and genuine social security. Yeah. If you can rely upon that, then you have perhaps the capacity to make decisions with the cash that's left over for your changing set of circumstances. Messaging to parliamentarians. We're engaged in informal discussions with the parties in the run-up to the election. I can't say too much about that because, again, we have to be non-partisan. But we are seeking recommitment to the 2017 Act and the unanimous support. We all know that statistics do not appeal necessarily to every audience. They're good for officials, they're good for economists, but they don't really translate to lay people nor politicians. Again, where the case studies, the testimony, the live experience that you can bring carries far more weight with such people. I think the first point about, can't really comment specifically on what to do when there is, as it were, nothing to do. But fundamentally in social policy, I don't believe that there are insoluble problems. There are from where we are. But again, another virtue of the minimum income guarantee is if we did have essentials, if we did have security, then there would be that underpinning that when people did present of necessity, because lives are varied and complex, to Citizens Advice, at least there would be that safety net there that should be in place to give people a basis from which to build their lives.
And finally, Teresa, anything you'd like to reflect on?
Yeah, and I think that's what I had mentioned as well, that it's becoming increasingly difficult for advisors because, as we know, sometimes advice isn't enough and there are no answers. But in those situations, it's about standing beside the client to help them navigate what's in front of them and provide any support that we can. And also feeding that and these stories as we back to the policymakers so that that does influence change, so that that doesn't become the norm, I think.
Absolutely. We are fast running out of time, and I'm going to abuse my role as chair of the panel and kind of bring us into land. I'm going to ask each of you, if you were to have just one ask, just one, friends, just one ask of this next Scottish Government in relation to everything that we've been discussing this afternoon, what would your one ask be for this next Scottish Government? David.
So I'll base my answer, try to anticipate what others across the panel might say. Think about what would a world-class advice service look like? What would a genuinely world-leading anti-poverty infrastructure looks like, and how do we make that happen? I think there's pockets of this happening, but they're happening in isolation. Not it's happening in routes out of crisis. But how do we make sure that isn't people's experience by exception, and that instead that level of services is standard for anyone when they need that type of support?
I think if this audience doesn't know what my one recommendation is, then I've not communicated it very effectively. Our first recommendation, our advice is the Scottish Government and people get behind introducing a minimum income guarantee.
Absolutely, yeah. And Teresa?
And for me, it's long-term sustainable funding for advice services so we can prevent crisis rather than just respond to it.
Absolutely. And the synergy in the way that these things are all completely interlinked, I think is really important. We are fast running out of time. It's been incredible to have this discussion and hear from our panel and to hear from your reflections as well. I think one of the things that seems to be really cutting through from everything that we've spoken about today is the need for us to tell a better story, for us to use the evidence and the insight, the experiences of people in local communities, the experience of advisors, and shine a light not just on the problems and the harm that people are facing, but the solutions that exist out there to change the status quo so that all of us truly can live a decent and dignified life, and that we can believe that that is something that is truly possible. If you didn't get a chance earlier to scan the QR code and to sign up to our mailing list, I'm going to give you another little opportunity to do that. It should literally only take you a minute. We have an online episode of foreCASt coming on the 3rd of March at 10 a.m. On that session, we're going to be discussing the transition to net zero and what that needs to look like for households on the lowest incomes, those who are facing perhaps some of the greatest challenges living in remote or rural communities, people with disabilities and long-term health conditions. How do we have a transition that's truly just and truly inclusive of everybody? I hope you'll join me in saying thank you to the panel for your expertise, your wisdom, for answering questions and being with us. And just thank you to all of you for choosing to come along to this session, to engage, to ask us lots of questions. We have loved having you with us on this episode of foreCASt. Thanks so much.